This week is a long one, 5 days. So this Wednesday, April 19th, we are at the end of our math unit. And so today, I believe today we're taking the end of unit test or doing the review. I'm not sure. I think we did the review yesterday. So we're taking the end of unit test for unit 11. In language arts, we're kind of midway through. You guys are working really hard writing your essays right now. And today we started a new lesson, lesson 1004, that's more on the revolution, which is cool. It's kind of a long one. You have 2 days for it. And then it has a worksheet in the middle of it where you're supposed to compare and contrast two of the stories that you read, but that's not the final assignment. The final assignment is a quiz for this one. So 1004, doing it today, turning it in tomorrow. And then we're doing the spiral review for pages 28, 29, and 30. And then today we have our last social studies, Beaverton social studies unit lesson. And then after this one, we'll start another social studies unit on all of the documents that came out of the American Revolution. So we've been talking a lot about the American Revolution, what led up to it. Today, you're going to learn a little bit more about the battles, the way the war went. It was like a 7-year war. It was a very hard war, fought a lot in the winter by these guys. They were not well equipped. They weren't a very wealthy army. The British had more money, but they had heart and they were fighting for a cause they believed in. And so they prevailed. But we're going to learn more about all the hardships and things that they went through in the war and why it was worth it to fight it anyway. So we're talking about the American Revolution. And then after that, we'll start a history unit on, like, after the revolution, what rules did the new country decide to have? Because this country had some pretty unusual documents, the Declaration of Independence, and then the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And they all guarantee things that a lot of countries and people and citizens don't have, a lot of rights and freedoms that you have. So that'll be really interesting to look into. For this morning's lesson, I thought about walking you through the whole lesson, but then I looked at it and I was like, oh, I don't know. I think that they can do that on their own. Here it is, 1004. It's got 10 pages, but about 4 of them are the language arts writing pages. It takes you through how to write an introduction, how to write a body paragraph, and how to write a conclusion, all in this lesson, which is, kind of interesting that they packed it all into one lesson. They talk about the shot heard around the world. And I know we have one of our book clubs who are experts on that. They've been reading that book. They know all about that.
We finished it.
You finished it already? Excellent. They talk about some figurative language, hyperbole, which is like the most amazing kind of figurative language in the world. Actually, hyperbole is when you exaggerate and say, I was freezing to death, which just means I was cold, but you exaggerate. So the gunshot heard around the world was not really heard around the world. It's just a way to exaggerate and use hyperbole. Hyperbole is when you exaggerate something and make it more extreme than it really is. On the next page, they go into some text features. And after the text features, we go into some reading. And they have you take a look at the roles of men from the different colonies. This is kind of interesting to look at just for this reason. The southern colonies in particular were very different than the northern colonies. And the reason that matters is because after the Revolutionary War, the next war we fought in the United States, we fought against each other. So once we got the country started, people had to try to agree on how to live. So this Men of the Colonies article talks a little bit about that and what happened with that. And on this page, they talk about how the Puritans came for religious freedom. They lived up there in the north in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. The middle colonies were formed exactly where the name suggests. They were kind of in the middle. But then in the southern colonies, life was different. They had these huge farms. They were very based on economics, and they relied on slavery. So having a rule against slavery was going to really hurt them economically. And that created that big rift between the North and the South, where we had the Civil War, which we won't talk about this year, but you're going to learn about that in the future. It's important to know that when people formed those colonies, they were all formed in different ways, some for religious reasons, some for economic reasons, and that affected the future of the United States. So then after you read that article, the next page also has some articles. It has this American Revolution scavenger hunt page, which you don't have to turn in. It's just for your own knowledge. Why did people leave England, form colonies in North America? Hopefully you know some reasons for that. But as you read these two articles, you're going to find out more reasons. They wanted freedom. They wanted religious freedom. They wanted to be able to rule themselves. They wanted farms and land, and they wanted stuff. They wanted trees and gold. Why did Britain begin taxing them? We've talked about that a lot too, right? They needed money because they had just fought some really expensive wars and they wanted the money. And they also wanted to control the colonists and keep them under control. Why did the colonists feel the need for democracy? That had a lot to do with them feeling like they weren't represented. They were being taxed unfairly. They were being treated really unfairly, and that made them mad. So there's this, but you don't have to turn it in. And then they say that you're basing that off these articles. So you can see here's the big reading for today. This would probably help you with your writing that you're doing. So if you wanted to get to this, I'm going to tell you right now, these articles are not in the resources because I looked for them. So here's the French and Indian War, taxes. This talks all about things that led up to the revolution, the Intolerable Acts. We've learned about a lot of these things already. Causes of the American Revolution, growing unity, the First Continental Congress, where they started to make agreements. Here is a timeline of the Revolutionary War, all the things leading up to it, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and the American Revolution began. So it's an interesting article. I'd recommend reading through it. The Birth of a Democracy. Again, we have a timeline kind of showing us what led up to the American Revolution. This is also a long story. So you can do that one so that you're ready for the quiz at the end. And then on the next pages, it starts into writing. And today we'll talk about it, but there are the writing prompts. Then they talk about writing an introduction. Actually, I guess they do that on page 6, the introduction. So if you haven't written your introduction, you might want to come look on page 6. On page 7, they start talking about the middle and the endings. So that's pretty fast, but they talk about body paragraphs and what to put in there. She's been trying to put her notes into full sentences to make a full body paragraph, paraphrasing or putting it in your own words. It talks a little bit about how to do the paraphrasing and gives you an example. And then they talk down here about how to build the body of your essay. And then they talk about the conclusion on this page as well. So like I say, it's like they go through the whole essay in 2 pages. So if you're having trouble writing your essay, I really recommend you spend some time on these pages reading through them. At the end of the unit tomorrow, it's got a quiz. 10:04, text features, Revolution and Democracy quiz. You can do it. Any questions about what we're doing with language arts today? Okay, so instead of doing the language arts lesson right now, I thought we'd spend about 5 minutes doing something a little more fun that can also test our knowledge of the American Revolution. So this is a website. PBS is the public broadcasting station. It's funded partially through our government. So it's pretty reliable, the information on it. It's got a couple of interesting things on this page. They have this whole thing. Would you have joined the American Revolution? So this is all about, who joined, who didn't join, and why, and what was going on to build up to that. And then this is this little quiz testing your knowledge about the American Revolution. I think we'll do this one tomorrow when we know a little bit more. Today, we're going to watch the first few minutes of would you have joined the American Revolution? But if you're a person who really needs to get your language arts done, if you find that you're falling behind and you want to go work on reading lesson 1004 and doing the quiz for 1004 or starting on it, I think you won't have time to do the quiz right now. Then you may go and skip this video and start working in a breakout room. Otherwise, though, don't just leave the meeting. So you can go to a breakout room and start working, or you can watch the video. here we go. Oh, I don't know if I did my screen share with the sound. Let me make sure I've got the sound. Yeah, I did not. Okay, here we go. Screen sharing. Can you guys see it?
Would you have joined the American Revolution? Because depending on who you were, there's a good chance that the answer would have been no. Although I haven't taken an official survey, I'm pretty sure if you asked the average US resident if they would have joined the American Revolution back in the 1770s, the answers of America, heck yes, and I don't know, maybe not, would be based on our current feelings about the US. But before we dive into history, there are some important things to remember for this particular thought exercise. First, in the 1770s, there was no way of knowing if this crazy revolution idea would work. There are lots of ways you could end up dead, either from fighting, sickness, or being killed for treason. And second, no one is American. There is no United States, and you are a British colonist or an adjacent group. And finally, although it's easy now to imagine that in our past lives we were all George Washington or the folks living in the fancy upstairs part of the house on Downton Abbey, chances were we would have been just a part of the larger population. So you have to put yourself in the uncomfortable shoes of the average Josiah or Jacoba and ask, when the conflict broke out, who would you have been? So you could have been, on a list that's not all-encompassing, an enslaved African-American laborer, Native American, women from all backgrounds, a white land-owning man, or a non-property-owning white colonist, also a man. So let's start with imagining that you were an African-American. By 1775, approximately 500,000 black people were living in the 13 colonies, and most of those people were enslaved. As a result, there's a high probability that if you were in this position, you were also enslaved. So for many colonial African Americans, while they had little legal recourse for decision making, they still exercised individual and collective autonomy and had to weigh their options. In 1776, Lord Dunmore, a British military commander, offered enslaved blacks their freedom if they would join his troops, and hundreds joined Dunmore's forces. Plus, outside of fighting, as many as 100,000 escaped during the course of the conflict, often with the help of British forces. George Washington, on the other hand, turned down official requests from African Americans looking to join the war, even though black soldiers participated in some of the earliest battles of the Revolution. The reason being, in some counties, black enslaved people were 25 to 50% of the population, so arming them was considered a huge threat to the white slave owning population, which Washington himself was a part of. But as the war raged on, by 1778, the colonists removed the ban on black soldiers, and as a result, an estimated 5,000 black soldiers joined their side. So for African Americans, the choice often came down to favoring the side that they felt would offer them the greatest potential for freedom, because, you know, that's what this whole war was about. Okay, let's say you were Native American. American here flagged for the continent and not for the country, folks. So if you were a Native American person living within or near the 13 colonies, you were likely choosing where and how to participate in this conflict based on your own desire to maintain autonomy apart from the colonies. Because remember, there was no US, just independently or cooperatively functioning Native American nations and 13 kinda connected British colonies. And often, white colonists' interactions with Native American populations were not peaceful. See Bacon's Rebellion if you want to learn more about how Native Americans were affected when colonists tried to rebel against the colonial government. Plus, at the end of the French and Indian War, the British issued the Proclamation of 1763. After a revolt led by Ottawa Chief Pontiac, King George III issued this proclamation to prevent further expansion westward by white colonists. He forbade all 13 colonies from buying land west of the Appalachian Divide, in effect creating a firm boundary on the wayward settlers who were increasing the number of raids. So, because of these reasons, many nations decided to side with the British. However, because of regional alliances, some Native American nations did side with the colonists. So, as with any group, this was a political decision related to personal freedom and bargaining. Next, let's look at women of all backgrounds. Although women were not officially recruited to join the armed parts of the revolution, they still played a crucial role. For example, many Native, white colonists, and black women contributed to the war efforts on both sides through providing food, clothing, and upkeep for men who were fighting, although some of these decisions were made through choice and others through force and coercion. But there were ladies who also joined the fray on the battlefield. Take, for example, Prudence Cummings Wright of Pepperell, Massachusetts, who formed her own militia of 30 to 40 other kick-butt women to stand guard over their town and intercept suspected Tory spies. So for women, the decision to support or resist the revolution was also tied to individual autonomy and self-protection, and not just linked to whether or not their male family members decided to take up arms and chuck a bunch of tea leaves into the harbor. Also, check out Professor Deborah Newman and Professor Catherine Algore's research in the work cited for more info on Black women's history during the Revolutionary Era and politically connected women's roles in helping to shape early US politics. Okay, now let's say you were a free, white, land-owning male. According to Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, you know, that big heavy book a lot of high school students lug around, owning property was kind of a huge deal in the colonies. Land-owning white free men were the only ones who could run for office or have certain rights, and this model continued into the formation of the early United States. Zinn notes that in Maryland, under the 1776 Constitution, a white man, an important distinction here since this wasn't extended to basically anyone else, had to own 1,000 pounds of property to run for state senator and 5,000 pounds of property to run for governor, and that's in money, not weight. These restrictions effectively excluded 90% of the state's population from ever holding office. Yet, if you were a super wealthy landowner, it was more likely, though not guaranteed, that you considered siding with the British because you were already collecting taxes and at the top of society. But some property owners weren't necessarily the uber wealthy. Mid-level property owners who were primarily small farmers were concerned that they could lose their land as a result of joining this newfangled independence idea, either because their untended farms wouldn't produce enough to pay their taxes, or because if this whole uprising thing didn't pan out, that they could lose their land as a result and, you know, their lives. So for many landowners, it was a high risk, high reward, but for many who were already landowning colonial officials, it was potentially high risk and little reward. And that leads us to a big portion of who was drawn into the fray: white men who were poor or didn't already own property. Although, as we mentioned above, many people of all backgrounds joined the fight both against and in support of the colonists, a lot of men in this particular category stood to gain a great deal, and as a result joined the war effort because the Continental Army offered money, and perhaps even more importantly, land to men who enlisted. And land in the colonies essentially vaulted your political status. According to historian John Ferling, although the initial call to arms was very popular, this dwindled as time went on. He writes that when the British Army marched from Boston on April 19, 1775, a bunch of messengers raised the alarm, including elementary school favorite Paul Revere. By the next day, Massachusetts had 12 regiments, Connecticut later drummed up 6,000 fighters, and within a week there were 16,000 recruited fighters from 4 New England colonies. Then in June, the Continental Congress took over the New England Army and made the Continental Army. But over time, Ferling also notes that this enthusiasm waned, particularly when soldiers realized that joining the wartime effort was dangerous and challenging. As a result, throughout 1776, many colonies had to offer enlisted troops cash, blankets, supplies, and short enlistments of less than 1 year in order to get more men to join the war efforts. But over time, enlistments of 3 years became the standard. In 1777, Congress recommended a draft to the states, and by 1778, most of the fighting states were conscripting men, since voluntary enlistment quotas weren't being met. So even the potential to own land and receive payment for service wasn't enough to drive the large numbers that the colonies needed to fight the war. So if you were in this group, you could gain money and land, or you could lose your life in a lot of different ways. Heck of a choice. So, how does it all add up? It seems like the answer to whether or not you would have joined the American Revolution is a bit murky, because the stakes were high and the outcomes unclear, especially before France allied with the colonists. Although some people stood to gain a lot from colonial upheaval, others stood to lose a great deal, and these categories weren't always represented as discrete considerations. And trust me, I know I've probably left many sides out of this historical Rubik's Cube, but I wanted to ask you, would you have joined?
Interesting to think about. So that's interesting, because we just talked about how they fought the war because it was the right thing to do, but now it sounds like they really fought the war because either they were going to get something or stand to have more freedom. So very interesting. You guys can take off. You've got about 10 minutes until specials. Make sure and do lesson 1004 today, and I'll see you at 11 or 10 o'clock for math. Okay, bye. Bye-bye. Amoya and Kainoa, do you guys need to talk about your paper that you're doing? I'll send you to the same breakout room. Okay. Yeah, Mila, what do you need?
What time is the